Medicaid, or are there ways to make it so that you... Hey guys, this is Josh Nelson from Nelson Elder Care Law. Definitely appreciate you joining with us again. We're going to cover a really important topic today that I think a lot of people are very interested in. How to make sure that whenever your spouse goes through the care journey and gets to the point where they need around-the-clock care, how do we get that covered? How do we get Medicaid to pay for that? And how do we do it by leaving what we call the well spouse, or you, if you're the one as a caregiving spouse, still enough resources to live on? Do you really have to be broke in order to qualify for Medicaid? Or are there ways to make it so that you still keep your house, that you still keep your income, so that you still have money to live on? Those are things we're going to talk about today, so thanks for joining us. Before we get too deep into it, we've already done one session on what Medicaid is and what it isn't, but I want to just do a quick recap for the people that are joining us today. Medicaid, not to be confused with Medicare, Medicaid is a program that covers long-term care, especially whenever somebody gets so sick that they need help with being able to ambulate or move around on their own. They get cognitive impairment that's so severe that they can't live independently anymore, and they need supervision that's more than just what can be provided at an assisted living, especially at the home. It's important that we look at these programs that we plan for them because they can be a huge saver to not only your legacy, but also your spouse's quality of life. Whenever we start talking about the kind of care that Medicaid covers, in the state of Georgia, it covers skilled nursing care that often costs somewhere north of $7,000, sometimes up to $9, $10, or even more $1,000 a month. If we have a $120,000 a year bill, or even a $90,000 a year bill, and we can get the government to pay their portion of it, we usually want to do that. And we'll talk about why that's a good thing. Just as a recap, in our state, there's not a big difference between what we call a Medicaid skilled nursing facility or a traditional skilled nursing facility. There's a couple communities that do have religious exemptions that don't have to accept Medicaid, but for the most part, anywhere that you're looking at or anywhere that your spouse or loved one's going to is going to be a Medicaid bed if it's a skilled nursing facility. What normally happens is some kind of care event happens, like a fall, a stroke. We go to the hospital, we get discharged through rehab, and at some point, Medicare is going to stop paying. At that point, we're either well enough to go home, or we're so sick that we need around-the-clock care, and we're going to stay there. If we stay there, that's usually whenever families get hit by this big curveball surprise. You only usually get about 2, maybe 3 days to know when Medicare is going to stop paying. That's the insurance that covers the first 20 days. Sometimes it'll cover more than that depending on how well your spouse is recovering. But it's important to know that whenever that time's up, usually the average fee is going to be between $250 and $350 a day. If we multiply that out by 30 days, that's whenever we get those really big, scary numbers. And that's unfortunately where a lot of people reach out to our office, is they're going through one of the most stressful times of their life. Their spouse is sick, especially during these times whenever there's not as much access to them to see what's really going on. It's important that whenever they get this information, they get that call from the business office at the community, they know how to react. The options here are often pretty staggering. Sometimes the business office will reach out to you and say, we don't have a bed available. And if that's the case, we definitely need to talk right away. And that's because you don't want to take custody or take your spouse home with you, because it's a lot harder to get them back into a skilled nursing facility or care community after you bring them back home, especially whenever they have some kind of high need. Often it's not safe for you to care for them at home, and we don't want you to be put in the middle there. There's discharge planners and social workers that work at the different communities whenever you're switching from rehab that will help you find a suitable bed for your loved one. We want to make sure that they're doing their job and helping you through this process. A lot of times, whenever somebody does make the mistake of taking their loved one home and trying it at home for a few days before we go back, just because we weren't able to care for them safely at home, they find that they run into a big problem, which is you have to private pay for the first month. And this brings us to our first main point about Medicaid, especially when you're dealing with a spouse. The way Medicaid works is if you're not eligible on the first day of the month, you're not eligible for that whole month. So it waits until the next period or the next first of the month before you qualify. And so by bringing your spouse home and then trying to get them back in, you may have just lost $8,000 to $9,000 worth of value. And that's a big deal. A lot of the people that we help with this process don't have those kind of funds available to just be wasting. I think all of us can honestly say if we have the option between losing 8 grand or not, we'd choose not. The next thing that we have is kind of a myth is that they're not going to get good care on Medicaid. And I think the thing that we really need to think about with that is that everybody's going to get the care that they request. A lot of these communities are really understaffed. I think that whenever we start talking about good communities versus bad communities, especially whenever we start looking at reviews online, we have to take it with a grain of salt. And what that means is if we know that everywhere is a little bit understaffed, just because by nature they're underfunded programs. Whether you're private paying or whether the Medicaid's covering your coverage doesn't really change what your care is. There's other things that we can do though. I like to always use the term, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. Whenever we have children or spouses that aren't able to come visit, aren't able to check on their loved one, kind of fall into that unfortunate out of sight, out of mind process, we know that the people that don't have visitors aren't getting as good a care as the people that are. And so the biggest thing that you can do to make sure that your loved one's getting that care is check up on them. And I know right now, because of COVID restrictions, nobody's going and seeing everybody in person. There's a couple communities that are allowing visitors for outside kind of individual one-on-one visits, but for the most part, you can't do that. But you still need to be checking on them, calling. A lot of the communities during this problem have set up where you can video chat with them through tablets. You can go get a tablet for $100 right now that will do video chat. And I think that's a great investment for somebody. The nurses or the nurses' aides will be glad to set that up for you so you can check in on your loved one and make sure that you can see how they're really doing. A lot of people are going outside the windows for their loved ones, and that has mixed results. I want to be really clear on that, especially if your loved one has some cognitive impairment, vision issues, and especially hearing issues. Sometimes that can be more frustrating for them than just actually doing a video chat. If somebody sets that video chat up for them, it makes it a lot easier for them to understand what's going on, especially what we've experienced with the people that have cognitive impairment, is it's frustrating for them to not understand why you can't come in. And so we might want to avoid that depending on your loved one's specific situation. There's other little tricks and treats that you can do. One of my favorite is a candy bowl. And so we know that if your loved one's going into a skilled nursing facility and we know that they're a little bit understaffed, we still know that the people there want to do their best. They want to help care for people. And so sometimes just a little candy dish, again, individually wrapped. Don't be putting M&Ms or Skittles or something in there. But something that has individual wrap, those little mini chocolate bars or Hershey's Kisses are always a good one. Put it kind of inside the door. And a lot of times they'll come in, grab something out of it. And any decent person, which most of the people that work at these communities are going to say, hey, how are you doing? And that makes a big difference in the quality that your loved one's going to get. Another treat is dropping off some Starbucks or some cold Diet Cokes or just some beverages like that to the nurses station. Remember that these caregivers are people too. And so it helps whenever they know that you care to maybe give your loved one a little bit of extra care too. At the end of the month though, we have to worry about who's paying for all this. And especially as a spouse, one of the things that a lot of people are afraid of is if my loved one goes into the nursing home and it's costing $8,000 or $9,000 a month, how do I have money to live on? The average Social Security for a couple is only around $3,000. And so we're talking about care costs just for one person being triple that amount. That's pretty scary. The great news is there's options, especially like Medicaid. People always ask, when should I do some planning for Medicaid? And the short answer is about 5 years and a day before you get sick. But because none of us have a crystal ball, we need to go ahead and get it taken care of as soon as you feel comfortable doing it. What we do with Medicaid planning is make sure that you fit underneath the resource limits. So in our last lesson, whenever we talked about Medicaid, we talked about if you're an individual going into a care community like a skilled nursing facility, You're only allowed to have $2,000 to your name and then a couple exempt assets in order to qualify. The good news is that if you're married and you have a spouse, that number is significantly higher. You're allowed to have a little over $128,640. I like to just say $129,000 to keep it easy. For that $129,000, that can be your cash assets, that can be your money markets, your CDs, your stocks. You don't have to include your qualified funds like a 401k or a 403b if you were a teacher. There's some exemptions to those numbers that we want to talk with you on an individual basis, but for the most part, it's really great to hear that you don't have to be under that $2,000 umbrella. The reason that the state has set it up this way is because there's still a healthy person that has to live off this money, and that's who we call the well spouse. That well spouse is always worried that the state is going to come take their house, that they're going to take all their income, that they're not going to be able to live. And I want to put you kind of assurance that there is a way for you to be able to keep your income. There is a way for you to be able to keep your house. It just takes a little bit of planning. Like I said before, the best time to plan is about 5 years in advance. But I'll tell you that especially whenever we deal with a lot of married couples, they just haven't. Or maybe they've planned improperly. So they've thought that something like a revocable living trust helps shielded Medicaid assets. A lot of times whenever somebody gets a revocable living trust, they hear that it protects assets. And I'd caution everybody with the word protect to really dig deeper and ask what it protects from. While a revocable living trust absolutely protects from probate if it's properly funded, it doesn't protect from the look back period of Medicaid. And that's a really important distinction. You can't just give away stuff. You can't just transfer assets. You got to think about doing this in advance in order to make sure that you fit underneath these certain caps. If you fit under these certain caps and you've done planning in advance, you absolutely can keep anything that you have. And that's really important. Most of the people that come in, unfortunately, are in crisis. And the way that we define crisis is that their loved one is having some kind of care now or will be within the next 30 days. That's a crisis to us. It's a crisis to the family. Why that's an important time frame is because there's still options. Just because you didn't plan 5 years in advance doesn't mean we can't do things today to make sure that you don't lose your home, to make sure that you don't lose your joint assets, to make sure that your spouse has income to live on. It's really important that we look at what the budget is and how it affects everybody. Whenever we start talking about income and what it takes to live on, Medicaid's even going to allow for the spouse to keep thousands of dollars of income every month. It doesn't all have to go to the nursing home. A big question that we get asked is maybe the person that's sick or the one that's receiving care has $2,000 worth of income. And maybe their spouse only has $1,500 worth of income. How do we structure that in a way so that the spouse can still live? Because we know that if it was an individual, Medicaid takes most of their income. Whenever you have a spousal situation like that, you're actually able to keep almost all the income that we talked about there. Almost $3,200 of the income can be saved for the well spouse. And we can even make that number higher if the well spouse isn't always well. Maybe they have high prescription costs, maybe they have some in-home caregivers, or often we find that maybe they live in an assisted living. And so we all know that assisted living costs somewhere north of $3,000 a month. And so say that you lived in an assisted living, your spouse had a stroke, and you go to a nursing home. Your spouse goes to a nursing home, and they were saying that they can only keep $3,200. Well, that's not enough to pay for your assisted living. So there's some waivers that we can claim that we'll be able to still get your assisted living paid for as long as there's enough income to go around. And that's really helpful because it takes the stress off of knowing that not only is the husband, but also the wife getting the care they need, and then there's an available funds to pay for that. Again, we talked about there's some exemptions to this, and a lot of times what happens is couples are living at home. One of them has some kind of incident, whether it's a stroke, a fall, some kind of illness, maybe even it's a routine surgery that doesn't go as planned, and recovery goes worse. At that point in time, if one of the spouses is moving out of the home and having to stay in a skilled nursing facility, getting that 24/7 around the clock care. A big fear that people have is that the state is going to come back and take the house. And in some cases, that can happen, especially whenever you don't plan. In this case, it can be a crisis plan. It doesn't need to have happened the 5 years in advance. What we need to focus on, though, is the 30-day window before and the 30-day window after applying for Medicaid. We're allowed to transfer assets between spouses, and because of that, we can do things, especially if we have a healthier spouse, to be able to protect a majority of the assets. Sometimes people will make mistakes. They'll do something like put their kids on their home. For Medicaid purposes, that's a very, very bad idea in almost all situations. It's also a bad idea for tax purposes. None of us want to pay the government any more taxes than we have to, and a lot of us don't realize some of the ramifications because we haven't fully looked at all the options. But if you add something like your kids as joint survivors with rights of survivorship to your house, the problem that you run into is not only does that skip probate, which is a nice thing, but it's a penalty period for Medicaid, and it also makes it so that because it's not their primary residence, whenever they receive it, there's a good chance that they have to pay a higher tax bracket on any kind of proceeds whenever that house is sold if they don't ever claim it as their primary residence. Those are the kind of things that whenever you work with an attorney, they're going to walk you through to make sure you're not taking those missteps. Say that you've already done something like that and you're worried about what happens next. Maybe you're still healthy, but you know that you put your kids on your bank account, and after seeing some of our series, you realize that was a bad idea. Maybe you put your kids on your house. There's always the option to undo those things, what we call curing the gift. We can help you walk through that process and make sure that you get a plan that actually works for you and your spouse. Whether or not it's a crisis, whether or not it's pre-planning, we want to make sure that you have confidence in really the details. Unfortunately, sometimes we have people come into our office that think they're protected and they aren't. And I'll tell you, this is one of the saddest stories. And it's because if you haven't done any planning yet, we have to assume that you knew there were bad things that could happen to you. But I think one of the things that upsets me most is whenever people have done some planning and they come in, they felt confident because they worked with an attorney on some parts of their estate plan, or they feel like they got some good advice from a financial advisor. And at the end of the day, it just doesn't play well with the long-term care costs like Medicaid. Things like annuities are pretty scary whenever we start talking about Medicaid. Remember that that lifetime income stream can be a great thing, but depending on how it's structured, it might not be actuarially sound in comparison to the way that Medicaid looks at it. If your life expectancy is only 14 or 20 years and you get an annuity that goes into a year supposed to be 120, Medicaid is going to penalize you for that. And those are things that are hard to undo without taking big hits through annuity penalties. But those are all things that we can walk you through. The biggest thing to remember is that if your spouse gets sick, even if you haven't planned yet, there's always options. We want to make sure that even if it's a crisis situation like that, you can come in, talk with us, and sit through your exact details to figure out, can we help you protect the house? Can we help you protect your assets? How do we maximize the amount of income that you get to keep so that you live a better quality of life and your loved one gets the care they need? That's going to cover it for today as far as Medicaid and the spouses. We're going to go through some questions. If you have them, feel free to put them in the comment box. Otherwise, we offer a free consultation to be able to come in and review whether or not you're really protected for Medicaid. And we're glad to see you guys come in for that. What kind of questions do we have today?
Asking about spousal protection. So one spouse needs the nursing home and the other is perfectly healthy and fine and functioning.
Yeah, and so this is a very common situation. I love men from my grandparents' generation, a lot of you guys' parents' generation, and the love that they have for their spouse is amazing. It goes both ways between husband and wife often. But what I really find is that a lot of guys come in and they've been caring for their wife at home to the point that it's really killing them. To the point that not only are their kids, their doctor, usually even their pastor, telling them hey, this is too much for you to handle. And I think that it's a very good sign that they're a little bit prideful, a little bit embarrassed that they can't do it themselves anymore. But often what happens is they just can't do it. They can't lift their spouse. A lot of times with ladies, whenever they come in, if they're smaller framed and their husband's anywhere close to my size, you just can't lift them up. There's things you can't do anymore whenever you lose the ability to move, to ambulate or move around. And these couples come in and their spouse is just overburdened with stress and not understanding that there's a better way. There's a better way to get them a safe environment so that they aren't continually falling. There's a better way to make sure that you can restore your relationship, that from that caregiver patient relationship back to a husband and wife relationship. And one of the biggest regrets that I get from people is that the last few years, they didn't feel as much like a spouse as a caregiver. And you really can be both. But in order to do that, we have to set up that somebody's given the care and given the care in a way that protects both of you. The cost or the fear of the cost is often what keeps people from going down this path. We know that in-home caregivers are expensive. We talked about how assisted livings often cost more than what the average income for a couple is. If we get to the skilled nursing part, it's 3 times the national average of what income is to get that care. But if there's a program like Medicaid that we can get that care for your spouse, still allow you to keep not only your income, but even a good portion of your spouse's income in most cases, protect your home as well as your investments, your retirement accounts, it's a really, really great thing. And every case is a little bit individualized, so we need to sit down with you to figure out at least what it is. But generally, we can save almost every situation at least 50% of any assets you have in the home. If you're married, we can often save over 100% of the assets, which means that not only are you saving your assets, but you're getting the care paid for as well. And that's a big burden off of your spouse that's caring for you, or off your shoulders if you're the one caring for your spouse. The ability to be able to keep your income, get your spouse the care they need, it's a great gift. What other questions do we have?
That is it. That covers the community spouse allowance, right?
So the community spouse allowance is specifically an amount that the what we call the well spouse or the community spouse is allowed to keep. Right now in Georgia, the number is about $3,216. The problem with that is that number is movable. And so we can increase that number. We just have to have certain qualified expenses to do so. And so that goes to a little bit about what I talked about. If one spouse needs more medical costs or is in assisted living themselves, we can get that number bumped up. If that spouse is still at home, still working, things like that, we can do some things to modify the income. Sometimes we'll push the income off to the future. Sometimes we'll get qualifications or exemptions for that income. But we want to be able to keep as much income as possible for that community spouse so that they aren't just having to give their money as well to the cost of care for their spouse.
We have another question about, is memory care considered an assisted living or skilled nursing, and what impact do RMDs have, asset or income?
Absolutely. And so it's kind of a two-part question that I'll go through. If you're over the age to require RMDs, the RMDs themselves count as income. That's going to be divided by 12 throughout the year. Most people take their RMDs either monthly or annually. Some people do take them quarterly. We can play a little bit with timing on that whenever we actually go through the Medicaid plan. But for the most part, RMDs are going to be divided over 12 and then counted as income. That income still can be kept by the community spouse if there's some amount left in their allowance, but otherwise the income does go towards the nursing home. The asset of the qualified fund itself, as long as it's in payment or taking the RMDs, is an exempt asset in the state of Georgia. We are one of the few states that actually exempts that amount though. Most states, I believe it's somewhere like 46 or 48 of the 50 states, will require you to annuitize those qualified funds if you have them. In Georgia, our legislature has taken the right stance, or what I feel is the right stance, and say that because you've taken the steps to plan ahead and get that retirement fund going, you can actually take those as an exempt asset. If it is a qualified fund like a IRA annuity or something, the rules change a little bit on that, and we'll need to sit down and talk about your individual circumstances. But as a general rule, your 401k, your IRA, your 403b are not considered assets as long as you're getting your RMDs from them in Georgia. The next question that you had was whether or not a memory care unit is considered an assisted living or a skilled nursing facility. In the state of Georgia, memory care is part of an assisted living. And so, just to recap the care levels, most people start with care at their home, what we call in home caregivers. Then, if we're starting to talk about communities, there's what's called independent living, which is generally an apartment that provides some services, maybe meals, but not actual care for activities of daily living. The jump from that to assisted living is whenever we need help with things like hygiene, feeding, medication management. And so that's where the assisted living kind of kicks in. And then a portion of assisted living can also be what's called memory care units. Memory care units have staff that have been specifically trained in order to help people with cognitive impairment. There's a very gray line about whether or not you need to stay in an assisted living or a memory care unit. The general test is the patient a flight risk or a danger to themselves unless they have the extra supervision? In a memory care unit, there's a higher staff to patient ratio, and because those patients get the higher treatment, it usually helps them stay more familiar with their surroundings, more structured, and if something does go wrong, there's somebody there to step in right away. Even in assisted living, there's a lot of time whenever you're not around CNAs or staff or nurses, and so it can be scary if somebody has a frustration period where they suddenly don't realize where they're at, or they're going through different paranoias. Unfortunately, whenever people have cognitive impairment, a lot of times they forget where they're at or who they're around. And if they decide that they no longer want to be where they're at, that's usually going to be something where we got to switch over to a memory care unit. Memory care units usually have ingress and egress that's controlled, and that's just a fancy way of saying there's a keypad on the door, or some of the more sophisticated places even have kind of sensors that you can wear as a bracelet or an anklet that unlock the doors to the unit whenever somebody gets close. But most of them use a keypad on the door to be able to monitor people coming in and out. Years ago, whenever we started the firm, we saw a lot more people that were suffering from mobility issues or physical disabilities. But as the time has gone on, we see a lot more people suffering from cognitive impairment. And it's really scary from that perspective because a memory care unit is often going to cost somewhere north of $5,500 to $6,500 a month, which is even more expensive than a traditional assisted living. If you have a loved one that's going in there and you feel like we really need to plan for a budget conscious care plan, reach out to us. We have some communities that are really doing a great job keeping the prices so that people can afford to get that care for their loved one without having to pay thousands and thousands of dollars of shortfall each month. Remember, if you have a $6,500 a month bill and you only have $3,000 a month of income, you're literally paying over $40,000 a year as a shortfall. So we can do the math and quickly tell whenever you run out of money. And so we can help you plan for that. We can help get things in place so that as your loved one goes down that path, you have the legal authority to help them. And that helps us avoid the guardianship conservatorship problems. But in Georgia, memory care is not considered a skilled nursing. That being said, there are people that bypass a memory care unit and go from an assisted living straight to a skilled nursing facility, and it's because of cognitive impairment. Sometimes people in a memory care unit still need to move to skilled nursing because of the cognitive impairment. It really depends a lot on the availability of beds at the skilled nursing. Whenever you have somebody that's going into a community, they do an evaluation to see whether or not they need to be there, what needs they do need. And often for a nursing home or a skilled nursing facility, there's going to be a requirement for a prescription or prescribed care from a doctor or physician that can say, you need this level of care. For skilled nursing to qualify for cognitive impairment, it often requires the person to be late stage, or what we call severe cognitive impairment. So this isn't just a little bit forgetful. This is, I really need around the clock supervision. Maybe they've gotten to the point where they no longer know who they are, who their kids are. They don't know who their spouse is. They don't know how to do things like actually eat, chew, take care of themselves. Those are things that, even if you're fine physically, the cognitive issues can qualify you for skilled nursing. It's just a very high bar. And the problem with cognitive impairment is because it's not a straight line test, it's very fluid. One day you might qualify, and the next day you wouldn't. And so, depending on when that evaluation is or what the doctor's experience with the patient is, it can really change what we want. And that's why it's so important to have what we call a patient advocate, or somebody that's going through and helping the person that needs care really explain their situation. Remember that the doctors only see people for a few minutes every couple months in most situations. And so, if they're doing great during those few minutes, and a lot of people with cognitive impairment have built up skills or tricks or techniques to try and diminish or hide the cognitive impairment because they're embarrassed by it and they're afraid that people are going to, quote unquote, lock them up somewhere. It's important that the patient advocate really work with the doctors to make sure they have a good grasp of what's really going on.
Final question. The 2020 CARES Act, where RMDs are waived, how does that affect Medicare or Medicaid eligibility?
Great question. And so right now, even though the RMDs are waived, the Medicaid manual has not been adjusted to take that into effect. And so even if you aren't required to take it this year, the consensus so far is that it will still be considered exempt. I don't think people are going to run a problem with that. So far, we've actually been having great response from the Medicaid people. They are processing claims faster than ever in order to be able to make sure that people that are going in to a skilled nursing facility right now are getting the coverage that they need. And it hasn't been an issue with any way we've had so far this year.
Great. That was our last question.
All right. Well, thanks, guys. We really appreciate you joining us. Like I said before, I'm Josh Nelson from Nelson Elder Care Law. Appreciate you jumping in. I think it's a great learning experience. If you have some topics you want us to cover, feel free to send them over to us. Otherwise, if you have some current concerns about your plan, your parents' plan, your spouse's plan, or you just want to sit down and talk about a few things in this area, we offer free consultations to go over where you're at and where you could be. Thanks so much, guys.